Hello, with me today is Ali Reza Bojani, who's my colleague and is an expert in Islamic studies, and we're going to look at the whole question of what we mean by Sharia and Islamic law. Ali Reza, it's good to have you here.
It's good to be here.
Okay, we all hear every time we turn on the television, listening to the news, we hear about Islamic law and Sharia. Explain them to us in 5 minutes.
Okay,
So no pressure.
No pressure. Sharia and Islamic law, as you rightly say, they're associated with Islam, associated with contemporary political movements, right, left and centre. But the notion of Sharia seems to be one of the most misunderstood concepts associated with Islam, both from non-Muslims and Muslims in the modern period. So before we talk about Islamic law, I think let's just think a little bit about what we mean by Sharia.
Okay.
So the term Sharia itself, linguistically, is associated with words which reflect a path or a means to something. And in its early sort of Arabic usage, it suggested a means towards a watering place. So it's a path towards something very, very important. And of course, in the kind of Muslim worldview, the Sharia is used in a number of different ways. So this concept of Sharia, this path towards something so important, is used in a number of different ways. At some points, it's used to reflect the entire body of Muslim teachings, its theology, its ethics, and its regulative framework. But in the dominant juristic vision of Islam, or the vision of Islam offered by the jurists, Sharia has a very specific meaning, which I think is important to clarify. And this sense of Sharia is a body of regulative precepts in the knowledge of God. Okay? So it's an idea that in the knowledge of God, there are precepts, regulations, rulings for every aspect of human life. Now, this is something which is conflated with a modern concept of Islamic law. But I think it's very, very important for us to contrast the difference between a notion of law and this notion of Sharia. So for the jurists, they imagine that God, a knowing God, a wise God, has an opinion about everything. Okay, he would suggest, if we could get into the mind of God, okay, if we could get into the understanding of God, then surely God would have an idea about how best to respond to a greeting, how best to wash oneself, how best to enter a building, how best to distribute one's wealth after they have died. So the jurists in Islam, in their desire to seek in accordance with divine will, wanted to explore the Sharia. Now, what do we actually have? What do Muslims actually try and live by, those observant Muslims who feel that they wish to live in accordance with Sharia? Of course, they don't have the mind of God. Okay, what do they have? Is they have sources of Sharia which they rely upon to try and infer how humans ought to live in any given situation. So what we actually have in the writings of the jurists is another technical term called fiqh. Now, fiqh literally means a deep understanding. Okay, so a deep understanding, which in the juristic tradition meant to be, or came to be understood as a deep understanding of Sharia, which relied on certain sources and interpretive mechanisms. So first and foremost, we need to see that there's a distinction between Sharia as a regulative system for humankind and the knowledge of God, and fiqh, the human product of jurists' understanding of the sources of Sharia. Now, the sources of Sharia are generally considered within the dominant juristic traditions to first and foremost be the Quran, the revelation Muslims believe that Muhammad received, Muhammad's own life, practice and teachings as revealed in or as recorded in the Hadith, and then notions such as consensus, analogy, for certain schools, rationality. So what's very, very important to recognize is that there's an epistemic distance between an ideal notion of Sharia and the actual product of jurists when they came to talk about fiqh. So when we talk about Islamic law, in a modern sense, there's huge questions as what do we mean by Islamic law? And to move forward, we need to understand that even in this body of doctrine referred to as fiqh by the jurists, only a segment of these rulings are actually legal in the modern sense.
I am just delighted that you have, at the beginning of this conversation, I think I would have been one of those people who just saw Sharia as just a translation for the word Islamic law, or Islamic law was just a translation for Sharia. But we have to think of Sharia, the sources of Sharia, fiqh, and then law.
Absolutely. So from the, again, just to kind of emphasize this distance between Sharia, fiqh, and the, this actual attempt of humans to uncover divine will and then subsequently live in accordance with divine will. The term Sharia, which is so closely associated with Islam, only comes in the Quran, in that form, the Quran, a single time. So although it's seen as the dominant concept of Islam, we see it very rarely in the Quran. In a number of, if we stretch it and we find in a couple of different forms, maybe we could say 3 instances where this word is mentioned in the Quran. And scholars have suggested that it wasn't until the 3rd century that the term Sharia became so important as a vehicle of understanding Muslim normativity. Of course, Muslims were developing after the death of the Prophet and through the expansion of Islamic rule, a rigorous and dynamic normative system. But the concerns of Sharia go far beyond those things which are potentially legal. From the example that I gave you earlier, one of the amongst the major concerns of Sharia is how we ought to interact with each other on a very personal level, how to respond to a greeting, how to pray, how to fast, what sort of charity to give, when to give, as well as things which could become subsequently legal, like inheritance, marriage, divorce, but they only become actually legal in the modern sense, in my view, once they're given positive force by a suitable worldly authority, at which point they become the law of a state, the law of a community, or the law of a caliph or a sultan, okay, rather than the law of God.
Ali Reza, thank you.